and got to meet Prince William.
Dude.
How about that?
Last
Your
episode,
Royal Highness.
Last episode, I think
Prince
I was
William.
quoted as saying, fuck royalty.
Behind a sealed palace door, beneath stone corridors that had outlived wars, coronations, abdications, and funerals, Prince William did something almost no heir had ever done while the sovereign still lived. He asked for the vault to be opened, not the public archives, not the ceremonial records prepared for historians and tourists. This was the inner vault, the chamber that held private letters, restricted state memoranda, family agreements, sealed instructions, and documents so sensitive that even senior members of the royal household spoke of them in lowered voices. When the lock finally turned, it did not sound like a metal click. It sounded like a line being crossed. And what waited inside was not just an old file with Camilla's name on it. It was a secret powerful enough to shake the balance between love, duty, marriage, and the future of the crown itself. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single update, because this was not an ordinary palace story. It was the kind of development that changes how the public sees everything that came before it. The country thought it understood the shape of the monarchy after years of turmoil, compromise, illness, and careful public appearances. Yet what William found suggested that one of the most delicate arrangements in modern royal history had never been what it seemed. The public saw unity. Inside the family, the truth was far more painful. The shock was not simply that a vault had been opened. Royal households protect papers all the time. That alone would not have created a crisis. What made this different was why William went there, who authorized the move, and whose future might be affected by what those papers contained. The document packet tied to Camilla was said to concern not only her private standing inside the family, but also the limits that had quietly been placed around her role long before the country was ready to hear about them. That mattered because Camilla had spent years moving from controversy to acceptance, from outsider to consort, from public doubt to official recognition. To suggest that hidden conditions existed beneath that transformation was to suggest that the monarchy had built part of its stability on silence. Britain had expected an ordinary week of carefully measured royal business, a few engagements, a few photographs, a few soft statements about continuity. Instead, whispers began moving through the palace before dawn. Footmen noticed unusual movement near restricted corridors. Private secretaries were called in earlier than usual. 2 legal advisors were seen entering through a side entrance not typically used for routine household matters. And then came the detail that turned concern into fear. William had requested access, not as a son dropping into an administrative matter, but as the Prince of Wales preparing for constitutional clarity. Succession meant more than waiting for a crown. It meant preparing for every hidden burden attached to it, including truths that could not be postponed forever. Inside the family, the reaction was immediate and deeply human. William did not emerge from that vault looking victorious. He emerged looking older. Those who saw him described not anger at first, but a hard stillness, the kind that comes when a man realizes that what he had feared in private may have been smaller than the truth, and that what he had hoped to protect may already have been fragile for years. Catherine noticed it before anyone else spoke. She had seen him after national funerals, after difficult hospital updates, after family ruptures that played out under cameras. This was different. He was not carrying grief alone, he was carrying knowledge. That evening, in the private rooms away from the ceremonial apartments, Catherine asked him the question that no advisor could ask and no official memo could soften. Was it true? William did not answer immediately. He crossed to the window, stood in silence, and looked out over grounds that had always represented continuity to him. Then he said that the issue was not one secret, but what the secret revealed about years of private negotiation, quiet promises, and an unspoken fear at the heart of the royal household. Camilla, it appeared, had not simply married into the monarchy under difficult circumstances. She had done so under terms no one outside the innermost circle was supposed to see. The silence deepened, because if there were terms, then someone had drawn lines. If someone had drawn lines, then someone had foreseen risk. And if risk had been foreseen, then the palace had spent years presenting certainty while privately managing contingency. This was not just a family wound, it was an institutional vulnerability. But to understand why William went to that vault at all, the story did not begin in the chamber below the palace. It began months earlier, in a room glittering with chandeliers, uniforms, jewels, and centuries of tradition, during a ceremonial event that looked flawless to the nation and deeply uneasy to the family watching from only a few feet away. It was one of those evenings when the monarchy depends on choreography. Ceremonial order matters, because ceremonial order is message. Who enters first? Who stands where? Who receives what greeting? Who is included in the private supper? Who is seen in photographs? All of it tells the public what the institution wants understood, without ever saying it aloud. That night, something small happened. So small many outside the room never noticed. Yet inside royal circles, it was like hearing a crack under polished marble. Camilla, moving with the authority that had gradually attached itself to her position, made a change to the order of a private receiving line moments before senior guests entered. It was brief, it was practical on the surface, but it shifted precedence in a way that placed Catherine in a diminished position during a moment of symbolic importance. Ceremonial precedence meant the ranking of royal figures in public and semi-public settings. It was not vanity, it was hierarchy made visible. William saw it, Catherine saw it, two senior courtiers saw it. And most importantly, an elderly constitutional advisor, a man too experienced to mistake accident for intent, saw it and said nothing until much later. The public saw one smiling procession. Inside the family, the truth was far more painful. William did not confront Camilla that night. That would have caused a scene, and royal men are trained from childhood never to let raw emotion outrun structure. But he remembered every detail. He remembered the slight hesitation before Catherine moved. He remembered the expression on Camilla's face, calm and composed, but just firm enough to make it clear that the adjustment had not been confusion. He remembered the king appearing tired, not inattentive exactly, but not fully present in the way he once would have been. And he remembered a question that lodged in his mind and refused to leave. Who had allowed this balance to drift so far that even symbolic authority could be tested in plain sight? What happened next requires going back even further, to the years before Camilla's public rehabilitation had fully succeeded, when the crown, the household, and the family were trying to solve a problem they could not discuss honestly in public. The monarchy could survive many things, but not confusion about legitimacy. It could survive criticism. It could survive scandal at a cost. It could survive cold headlines and angry debate. But it could not survive a lasting sense that the line between personal desire and constitutional order had been erased. When Charles and Camilla's relationship moved from private inevitability to public reality, the institution faced a brutal question. How could the future king marry the woman he loved without destabilizing the emotional inheritance left behind by Diana? The expectations of the public, the position of William as future heir, and the already strained trust between royal duty and private happiness. No one believed there was a perfect answer. So the palace did what palaces often do when truth is too dangerous to reveal in full. It built a structure of managed language, careful titles, quiet assurances, and limited expectations. At the center of that structure, according to the papers William saw, was a private understanding. Not a law in the parliamentary sense, not a public proclamation, but an internal covenant, shaped by legal caution, family sensitivity, and long-term succession planning. A state communication was an exchange or memorandum carrying official significance inside the machinery of monarchy, even if never shown to the nation. These papers reportedly outlined the boundaries within which Camilla's elevation would be managed, especially in relation to future ceremonial influence, family representation, and any informal role in shaping the transition from Charles's reign to William's. The truth was more painful because the documents suggested that those boundaries were not merely suggested. They were negotiated, and one of the signatures attached to the earliest version was believed to be William's own, from a time when he was far younger, far less powerful, and under crushing pressure to preserve calm while the adults around him demanded compromise in the name of stability. He had expected concern. He had not expected anger when he later revisited those years in his mind. Yet anger came, not because the institution had tried to protect itself, but because protection had slowly become concealment. He had been told that certain compromises were temporary, certain allowances practical, certain sensitivities necessary, until the country adjusted. Temporary became habitual. Practical became political. Necessary became dangerous. When William discovered that the original file had not only survived, but had been amended over time, the matter changed entirely. Amendments meant review. Review meant ongoing management. Ongoing management meant somebody, somewhere, had continued updating the monarchy's private understanding of Camilla's place, even after public consensus appeared settled. That was why he asked for the vault. Camilla, meanwhile, was not ignorant of the danger. She had lived too long near royal power to mistake silence for safety. By the time rumors of William's visit reached her private secretary, she knew exactly which file he had likely gone to see. And for the first time in many years, the composure that had carried her through public hostility, family coldness, and slow acceptance began to fracture in private. Those close enough to witness it said she did not rage. She did not throw anything. She did not issue dramatic orders. She simply sat down, removed her glasses, and stared at a table where a dispatch box had been placed for the king earlier that morning. For several moments she said nothing at all. Then she asked one question in a quiet voice. Who authorized it? That question mattered because it exposed her deepest fear. If Charles had authorized the access, then the protection he had spent years building around her might no longer hold. If advisors had encouraged it, then palace consensus had shifted. If William had acted under wider constitutional guidance, then the issue was larger than family mistrust. It meant the monarchy itself was preparing to separate private affection from future institutional necessity. No one answered her directly at first. The official household was the network of private secretaries, legal advisors, senior courtiers, administrative officers, and ceremonial planners who keep the monarchy functioning day by day. Outsiders often imagine it as a background machine. It is not. It is memory, discipline, and control. When that machine begins moving quietly around a single issue, everyone important feels it before they understand it. Doors close more gently. Staff messages become shorter. Seating plans are reviewed twice. Attendance lists are reconsidered. Smiles harden. That was the atmosphere spreading through the palace. And then came the confrontation that many had feared for years, but hoped would never take place in such direct terms. William and Charles, alone, without speeches, without aides, without the protection of public ritual. It happened in a private sitting room that had seen generations of heirs learn how difficult it is to love a family that also functions as a constitutional instrument. Charles began with the language of caution. He said there were historical sensitivities, old wounds, practical reasons, and matters that had required tact. William listened. He allowed his father to speak in full. He did not interrupt. Yet when Charles finished, the son who had spent much of his adult life balancing respect with restraint, finally answered not as a boy protecting his father, but as the future king protecting the crown. He said this was not about punishing Camilla. It was about understanding what had been promised in the monarchy's name, and why those promises had continued to evolve without full clarity inside the line of succession. He said the family had lived too long inside layered silences. He said the future could not be built on private exceptions nobody dared name. And then he asked the question that reportedly froze the room. If the boundaries were meant to protect the institution, why had the institution been forced to protect itself from the very person it publicly asked the country to accept? No one raised their voice, but the pain in that room was heavier than shouting. Charles did not respond immediately. He had spent a lifetime torn between emotional loyalty and royal burden. He loved Camilla. That was the simplest part of the story, and perhaps the most tragic, because love had cost so much and still demanded more. Yet he also understood the logic William was invoking. The present reign and the future reign could not remain blurred forever. There comes a moment in every monarchy when sentiment must either be clarified or become a threat. When Charles finally spoke, he did not defend every decision. Instead, he admitted what few expected him to say aloud, that some agreements had been designed not because Camilla was unworthy of affection, but because the institution feared what would happen if roles, influence, and future expectations were left undefined. He said he believed he could manage the balance himself. He believed affection and discipline could coexist under his supervision. He believed time would soften tension. Yet time had not removed the contradiction. It had only hidden it under ceremony. William asked whether Camilla knew the full extent of the later revisions. Charles's expression, it is said, gave the answer before his words did. The truth was more painful, because once that possibility entered the room, the crisis deepened. If Camilla had not seen every later amendment, then she too had been living inside a managed arrangement, protected and limited at the same time. If she had seen them, then she had accepted a future in which her role would narrow sharply once William's reign approached. Neither version was peaceful. One was betrayal, the other was surrender dressed as composure. Catherine became essential at this stage, not because she sought conflict, but because she understood that what was collapsing was not only trust between people. It was the family's shared ability to speak honestly about power. She urged William to move carefully, to distinguish between emotional hurt and constitutional necessity. She reminded him that any revelation, if mishandled, would wound the king at a time when public fragility already shadowed the institution. Yet she also made one point with quiet firmness. The future could not begin under invisible terms written by others in darker times. That mattered, because Catherine had become, in the eyes of many inside the household, the emotional anchor of continuity. She was not merely William's wife in this story. She was the figure through whom the future legitimacy of the monarchy was meant to feel calm, humane, and stable. Any attempt to complicate or overshadow her standing was more than personal. It cut toward the architecture of the next reign. Within days, palace machinery escalated. A review team of constitutional counsel, senior household officials, and ceremonial advisors was convened under conditions of extraordinary discretion. Continuity planning was the process by which the monarchy prepares for illness, transition, incapacity, death, and changes in public role. It sounds clinical. In reality, it is one of the most emotionally ruthless activities in royal life, because it forces a family to turn love into structure. The review focused on several urgent questions. Were the documents still considered operative? Had informal practice drifted beyond original limits? Did Camilla's present role create expectations that might later provoke confusion or resentment during transition? And perhaps most dangerously, what would happen if the existence of the file became known before the palace chose its own language? The Lord Chamberlain's office, responsible for many of the ceremonial and administrative functions that keep the monarchy orderly, was pulled into discussions. Precedence charts were examined. Future event planning was quietly adjusted. Drafts of possible statements were prepared and rejected. Some advisors argued the file should remain sealed and the matter resolved privately. Others warned that secrecy had already lived too long and would become catastrophic if exposed by leak rather than controlled acknowledgement. Meanwhile, Camilla requested a private meeting with Charles. This confrontation was different from William's. It was not heir and institution. It was marriage under pressure. It was two people who had paid dearly to stand together, now facing the possibility that love had always been framed by conditions, one of them no longer controlled. She asked him directly whether he had protected her or managed her. Charles tried to answer with nuance, with history, with reminders of what they had endured to reach public acceptance. But nuance is a weak shield when trust begins to crack. Camilla said she had accepted ridicule, isolation, and years of slow rehabilitation because she believed, at minimum, that the private truth between them was whole. If papers existed limiting her place in the future, then she could live with that if he had told her. What she could not accept was being carried forward beneath invisible ceilings, while asked to smile as though none existed. He reached for her hand. She did not pull away, but neither did she close the distance. That image says almost everything. Not rejection, not drama, not collapse, just the unbearable dignity of two people realizing that survival had required compromises so complex that even they no longer agreed on which compromises had been honest. The next turn came from an older figure whose influence was quiet but undeniable, Princess Anne. In royal storms, Anne often occupies a role that few public commentators fully appreciate. She is not decorative authority. She is operational loyalty. She understands duty in its most stripped form. When she learned enough to recognize the scale of the problem, she did not waste time on sentimentality. She told William that if the documents existed and affected the next reign, then avoidance was no longer prudence. It was weakness. But she also told him something harder. If he moved too quickly, he could turn justified clarity into public cruelty. Anne later spoke with Charles in terms only a sister could use. She reminded him that the crown cannot ask the nation to trust what the family itself refuses to face. She reminded him that protecting a wife is noble, but blurring the future is not. And she reminded him of an old royal truth. Every reign borrows time from the next one, but it may not spend that time selfishly. By then, newspapers had not yet published anything concrete, but the atmosphere outside the palace was beginning to shift. Journalists sensed tension in changed briefings, altered appearance schedules, and the sudden absence of routine warmth in certain public moments. A planned joint presence was quietly reconsidered. One senior broadcaster received an unusual call advising that palace lines on future ceremonial structure should be handled with careful precision. In media language, that is often the scent of a locked room beginning to leak. And leak it did. Not all at once. Not with a single dramatic dump of pages. That is not how royal crises usually emerge. First came a hint about a sealed file concerning consort arrangements. Then a suggestion that the heir had sought restricted access to internal records. Then an unnamed source saying that future role definitions were under review. Within hours, commentators who normally spoke in polished generalities were suddenly discussing constitutional sensitivity, private understandings, and whether there had always been limits on Camilla's influence after the present reign. The nation was stunned, not because every detail was known, but because the very possibility changed the emotional map. People who had supported Camilla's gradual acceptance felt unsettled. Those who had never fully trusted the palace narrative felt vindicated. Others saw with fresh sympathy just how impossible modern royal life had become. A system demanding sincerity while rewarding silence, demanding public strength while feeding on private restraint. Broadcasters interrupted lighter programming for developing royal context. Newspapers prepared rival front pages. Crowds gathered outside palace gates, not in panic, but in that particular British manner of waiting for symbolism. They watched the curtains, they watched the cars, they watched which flag moved in the wind, and who stepped out beside whom. Because in moments like these, the monarchy speaks before it speaks. Inside, the question became whether to deny, deflect, or acknowledge. William argued for controlled truth, not total disclosure of every paper, every phrase, every old compromise, but enough honesty to end the era of ambiguity. Charles hesitated. He knew what acknowledgement would imply. It would not simply reduce Camilla to a controversy again. It would confirm that even at the highest level of royal presentation, acceptance had been conditional. It might also trigger renewed moral judgment on decisions already soaked in history and pain. Camilla, after a night said to be almost sleepless, made a choice few expected. She told Charles she would not be defended by another architecture of half-truths. If the palace intended to speak, it should speak with dignity, not manipulation. She would not endure years of public hostility, only to become the silent subject of one more carefully engineered illusion. It was, perhaps, the strongest position she had taken in the entire crisis, not because it secured authority, but because it relinquished the fight for appearance. That did not mean she was at peace. Far from it. The emotional cost was written across everyone who saw her the following morning. Yet there is a particular strength in royal life that comes not from triumph, but from accepting the shape of limits. Camilla had spent years proving she could withstand rejection. Now she was being asked to withstand definition. A draft statement began to take shape. Every line was contested. Every word carried danger. Review sounded defensive. Clarification implied confusion. Future arrangements sounded cold. Family understanding sounded weak. Constitutional guidance sounded too technical. Personal agreement sounded too intimate. In the end, the working language centered on continuity, established internal understandings, and the distinction between present service and future reign structures. It was careful, perhaps painfully careful. But beneath the caution lay a truth the palace could no longer conceal from itself. Charles's love had been accepted by the institution, but only within boundaries designed to protect William's future. When the statement finally went out, it did not satisfy everyone. Such statements never do, but it changed the terrain. The palace confirmed that historical understandings regarding future ceremonial roles had existed, and that internal review had reaffirmed the primacy of the Prince and Princess of Wales in all planning for the next reign. It praised Camilla's service. It emphasized loyalty, dignity, and continuity. It avoided the word secret, yet the country heard it anyway. Public reactions split along emotional lines more than political ones. Some saw William as decisive, a future monarch unwilling to let the institution drift under emotional pressure. Some saw Charles as tragic, a king who finally found enduring love only to watch that love become entangled in the very structures he was born to serve. Some saw Camilla anew, not as a victor over history, but as a woman who had lived inside conditions and consequences more severe than many understood. And many simply felt the old royal ache return. The sense that behind all the jewels, processions, and stone walls, this family never escapes paying for its own silence. Yet even then, the story was not finished. Because the final symbolic test was still to come. The nation needed to see whether the family had shattered or steadied. A monarchy can survive documents. It can survive scandal. What it cannot survive is the visible collapse of relationship at the exact moment it claims continuity. So an appearance was arranged. Modest by royal standards but loaded with significance. Charles emerged first. He looked thinner than he once had, more burdened perhaps, but composed. Camilla appeared beside him, not behind him, not isolated, not theatrically elevated, beside him. William arrived separately, then joined them, and after a measured pause, Catherine stepped into position at his side. It was only a few seconds of visual order. Yet those seconds carried years of pain, compromise, and recalculation. The present reign stood there, the future reign stood there, and between them was the truth nobody could fully unlearn. The monarchy had chosen to protect continuity, even at the cost of exposing how fragile continuity had become. Observers watched their faces with almost unreasonable intensity. Did William look cold? Was Camilla defiant? Did Charles appear wounded? The answers depended partly on what one wanted to see, but one moment was harder to dismiss. As the small group turned to move inside, Charles seemed to hesitate almost imperceptibly, and William waited. He did not rush ahead. He did not dominate the frame. He waited for his father. It was a tiny gesture, yet in royal language, such gestures are not small. They are mercy under discipline. Later, in private, there was one more exchange that may say more than all the statements. Catherine, after the appearance, is said to have told William that clarity had a cost, but confusion had a greater one. He answered that he never wanted this battle. She replied that some battles arrive because no one earlier was brave enough to finish them. That was the burden now, not to win, to finish. And what of Camilla? The most striking part of this entire crisis may be that her greatest secret was never simply a hidden document or a sealed condition. It was the quiet truth underneath them all, that she had lived for years at the center of the monarchy, while standing on ground that could never completely belong to her. She had love, position, ceremony, and duty. Yet the future had always contained a line beyond which her authority would not travel. That was not merely a legal fact, it was an emotional sentence. This was not the destruction of a queen. It was the exposure of an arrangement. It was the moment the palace stopped pretending that private devotion and institutional caution had ever fully become one and the same thing. William did not open that vault to humiliate Camilla. He opened it because the next chapter of the crown could not be inherited blind. He needed to know where the hidden lines were before the nation forced them into daylight on harsher terms. The monarchy chose preparation over denial. That is the deeper meaning of what happened. Not revenge, not theatrical purging, not a son waging war on his father's wife. It was a painful act of recognition. The present could be honored without being allowed to rewrite the future. Love could be respected without being given the power to erase structure. Secrecy could preserve peace for a season, but eventually secrecy itself becomes the threat. In the end, the family remained what it has so often been in moments of strain, wounded, disciplined, and still standing. Charles kept his loyalty to the woman he loved. William kept his loyalty to the institution he must one day lead. Catherine accepted once again that grace inside monarchy often means carrying burdens created long before one arrives. And Camilla, perhaps most of all, was forced to face a truth both cruel and strangely clarifying, that acceptance earned in public does not always erase the conditions written in private. So when people ask what Prince William really found in that vault, the answer is larger than one file and colder than one revelation. He found the cost of silence. He found the handwriting of compromise. He found proof that the crown had spent years balancing on promises no one wanted spoken aloud. And in unlocking that vault, he also unlocked the one thing palaces fear most when history is still alive inside them: a future that can no longer be delayed by ceremony. Thanks for watching. Please do not forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.